The unsolved mysteries behind the locked gates of Leavenworth. If you're brave enough to step deeper into America's darkest secrets, hit subscribe, because some truths stay buried unless someone digs them up. The first scream was so faint that most people inside the massive stone walls of Leavenworth assumed it was just another restless inmate crying out in the night. But the second scream, sharper, closer, echoing against the cold concrete, made the guards freeze. It came from the industrial laundry wing, a place that should have been locked tight after dusk. When Officer Daniel Briggs pushed open the metal door, he found the enormous machine still running, steam clouding the room, and an inmate's uniform lying in a heap on the floor. The problem was that the inmate who wore it, Matthew Harlan, a quiet, low-level forger, was nowhere to be found. The steam hissed around Briggs as he stepped further inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints on the recently mopped tiles, no blood, no torn fabric. Just that empty uniform folded almost too neatly, as if someone placed it there on purpose. Harlan wasn't the kind of man who caused trouble. He kept to himself, read books, and rarely spoke. Yet, within the next hour, the entire prison was locked down, alarms blaring, officers sweeping every hallway. They searched cells, rooftops, tunnels, and utility shafts. Nothing. It was as if the man evaporated into the air. News of Harlan's disappearance spread fast among staff, especially because it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. A decade earlier, another inmate, Robert Givens, had vanished during his work shift in the workshop. His disappearance was marked presumed escape, even though investigators admitted privately that no doors, fences, or windows showed signs of tampering. Then 3 years later, an inmate named Carl Renford died in his cell under conditions so strange that some guards whispered it was impossible. The cases were quietly closed, but the rumors stayed alive. When the warden, Samuel Keller, arrived in the laundry room that night, he stared at the uniform on the floor with an expression that was hard to read. Officers expected him to bark orders or demand answers, but instead he simply sighed and muttered, "Not again." That single phrase hit Briggs harder than the blaring alarm. It confirmed what many staff members had suspected. The prison had secrets that were never documented, never reported, and never explained. As investigators entered the scene, they interviewed Harlan's cellmates and co-workers. They asked whether he had enemies, debts, or plans to run. Everyone said the same thing. Harlan was quiet, polite, and never caused problems. A model inmate. A man with no reason to disappear. But one cellmate mentioned something strange. A few days before, Harlan received a letter he refused to show anyone. It wasn't from family, he had none alive. It wasn't from a lawyer, he didn't have an active case. He simply read it, folded it slowly, and tucked it deep inside his mattress. When guards searched the mattress hours after his disappearance, the letter was gone. Officer Briggs couldn't shake the unease he felt. The laundry room felt too calm, almost staged. He couldn't understand how a man could vanish in a space with only one locked entrance, cameras on both sides, and guards patrolling every 15 minutes. As the night dragged on, tension rose. Officers searched twice, then 3 times. Sniffer dogs traced Harlan's scent into the laundry room, and then nowhere else. It stopped abruptly at the center of the floor, as if he walked into the steam and never came out. Outside the prison walls, journalists began gathering the next morning, drawn by whispers that something unusual had occurred. Leavenworth had always been a place of dark legends. Stories of inmates being transferred in the dead of night, of government cars entering through the back gates, of visitors whose names never appeared on the logs. But the new disappearance felt different. The details were too clean, too empty. Something about the silence of the room, the untouched machines, and the perfectly folded uniform felt wrong. Agent Karen Doyle from the Federal Bureau of Prisons was assigned to the case. She arrived with a calm, focused demeanor but quickly sensed tension in the staff. Few wanted to talk. Some avoided her gaze. Others repeated the same rehearsed phrases. Doyle had worked dozens of inmate disappearance investigations, but Leavenworth felt off from the moment she walked in. It was in the air, the way officers stiffened at certain questions and the way the warden watched every conversation from a distance. She began tracing Harlan's final days. A pattern started forming, subtle but unsettling. Harlan had changed his routine recently. He spent more time in the library, checked out books on Cold War intelligence, and asked questions about historical inmate transfers. He even requested old newspapers from the 60s and 70s, focused on articles about covert government operations. When Doyle asked why he studied those topics, the librarian said, "He told me some stories don't make sense until you read the ones the government tried to make people forget." The deeper Doyle looked, the stranger the evidence became. Harlan wasn't just reading random history. He was following a thread, one tied to the prison itself. And then she learned something the staff had failed to mention. Before his arrest for forgery, Harlan worked briefly for a small contracting firm that handled document storage for several federal agencies. He might have seen files not meant for civilian eyes. Files connected to prisoner transfers. Files connected to Leavenworth. Days passed with no leads. Doyle returned again and again to the laundry room, convinced the answer was hidden there. On the fifth night, as she examined the floor drains, she found something small wedged between the metal grates. A torn piece of paper. The edges were burned slightly as if someone tried to destroy it. She unfolded it carefully. There were only 5 words written in shaky handwriting. They moved him again. Tonight. Her pulse tightened. This wasn't a message written in panic. It was written in warning. But the part that chilled her most wasn't the words. It was the faint initials at the bottom, HR. Harlan's initials. He wrote it. He knew something was coming. And whatever they meant, it wasn't a group she recognized. As Doyle stood alone in that dim room, steam rising around her, she realized something terrifying. Harlan's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a pattern, one that stretched back decades. And the next clue, the one that could break the entire case open, was hidden somewhere she had not yet looked. Then her phone buzzed. A guard's voice trembled on the other end. "Agent Doyle, you need to get to cell block C right now. We found something. And it changes everything." The line went dead. And the mystery of Leavenworth once again took a darker turn. Agent Karen Doyle reached cell block C before the alarms even stopped echoing. The hallway buzzed with anxious guards, their boots clattering on the old metal floors as if the building itself had started to shake. The block lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that never stayed still. When Doyle stepped inside the tier, every officer stepped back, leaving her a narrow path toward the open cell at the far end. The cell belonged to an inmate named Leonard Pike, a middle-aged man serving time for fraud and identity theft. But tonight, Pike wasn't in his bunk. He wasn't anywhere in the block. Instead, something else waited for her on the thin prison mattress. A small, rusted key taped to a piece of cardboard, and beneath it, a single sentence written in black ink. "Ask who signs the transfers." Doyle picked up the cardboard, studying the handwriting. It matched nothing she'd seen so far. Not Harlan's, not any guards, not any known inmates. The key itself was even stranger. It wasn't a cell key. It wasn't a cabinet key. It looked older, hand-cut, like something that belonged to machinery that hadn't been used in decades. "What was Pike's last movement?" she asked, her voice steady. A nervous guard stepped forward. "He went to the infirmary earlier today. Complained about headaches. They sent him back after an hour. And after that? Nothing, ma'am. He didn't show up for evening count." Doyle looked around the cell. No signs of escape. No broken vents. No smuggled tools. No disturbance. Just like Harlan. Another disappearance with no physical path out. But Pike wasn't like Harlan. Pike was talkative, nosy, and always looking to trade information for favors. If he vanished right after Harlan, it meant one thing. He knew something. And someone didn't want him speaking. As she stepped out of the cell, Doyle scanned the block. Every officer looked uneasy, whispering among themselves. Some avoided her eyes. Others watched her too closely. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that builds when a truth has been buried for too long, and the soil starts to crack. She walked toward the control room to review surveillance, but the moment she arrived, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The cameras facing Pike's cell had gone dark for exactly 11 minutes. The footage wasn't corrupted or damaged, it was missing. Deleted cleanly with no trace of who accessed the system. "Who was on duty?" she demanded. A guard swallowed hard. "Officer Raymond Mills." "Where is he?" No one answered. Doyle exhaled slowly. Mills was one of the oldest staff members in the prison. Quiet. Reliable. Almost boring. But he also had access to every system, every keycard, every maintenance panel. If someone inside the prison was helping orchestrate these disappearances, Mills was in the perfect position to do it. She decided to find him before the trail went cold. As she crossed the yard toward the admin building, the wind picked up, carrying the faint hum of the perimeter lights. Leavenworth looked calm from a distance, solid walls, stone towers, and order. But inside, hidden movements were unfolding like a secret play, each act darker than the last. When she reached Mills's office, she noticed the door was cracked open. She pushed it gently. The room was dim, illuminated only by a single desk lamp. Papers were scattered everywhere. Old logs, transfer forms, disciplinary reports. But something stood out immediately. A small wooden box sat on his desk, unlocked. Inside the box were keys. Dozens of them. Some modern. Some ancient. Some tagged, some blank. And directly on top of them was a folded slip of paper. Doyle opened it. "Stop digging, Karen. This place keeps its own secrets." Not signed. But she didn't need a signature. Only a handful of people even knew she was investigating off the official record. Someone was watching her moves in real time. A creak behind her made her turn sharply, but the doorway was empty. She stepped into the hallway, scanning both directions. Then she noticed faint footprints on the floor, small amounts of dust disturbed by someone who had walked quickly toward the basement stairwell. She followed the trail cautiously, the lights growing dimmer as she descended. The basement of Leavenworth was older than the rest of the prison. Built in the early 1900s, it still carried the smell of moisture, rust, and time. Pipes rattled overhead. The air was colder. Doyle's footsteps echoed through the long hallway of abandoned storage rooms and mechanical chambers. As she reached the end of the corridor, she found a metal door with peeling paint. The rusted key she found in Pike's cell slipped perfectly into the lock. She turned it slowly. A heavy click echoed through the hall. The door opened into a room she had never seen on any blueprint. Dust-covered shelves filled the walls. Metal filing cabinets lined the back. And at the center sat a large table covered with documents, transfer orders dating back to the 1950s and 60s. Most were routine. But a handful were marked with a bold black stamp. Classified, do not archive. She lifted the first file. It listed inmate transfers that never appeared in prison logs. Prisoners moved without reason, without approval signatures, sometimes without arrival records at the next facility. A chain of vanishing stretching back decades. The second file was worse. It listed names. Not just inmates, guards, doctors, clerks, employees who resigned or retired, but were never seen again. And the third file. Doyle opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, the laundry room where Harlan disappeared. But the photo wasn't recent. It was taken in 1963. Same room. Same layout. And in the bottom corner of the image was a machine that no longer existed. A maintenance hatch sealed after renovations in the 80s. A hatch connected to an old underground transfer tunnel. A tunnel no one had told her about. Her heart raced. If the tunnel was still intact, someone inside the prison could move people undetected. Harlan. Pike. Maybe more. She reached for the next page in the file, but before she could read it, she heard footsteps behind her. Slow. Heavy. Intentional. They echoed down the corridor, steady as a heartbeat. Someone else knew about this room. Someone who didn't want her here. She turned toward the door just as a shadow moved across the hallway light. A voice whispered from the darkness. "You weren't supposed to find this." The door slammed shut, and everything went black. The darkness swallowed the room so fast that for a moment Karen thought the power had gone out across the whole prison. The air felt thicker, like the walls themselves moved closer. She took a slow breath, forcing her heart to settle, and listened. The only sounds were the soft hiss of old pipes and the echo of footsteps just outside the door. "You weren't supposed to find this," the voice said again, closer this time. It was calm. Too calm. "Mills?" she asked. Silence stretched for a beat. Then she heard a faint, tired sigh. "Yeah," he answered. "It's me." Her eyes began to adjust to the dark. She could just make out his outline in front of the door, broad shoulders, uniform, the faint shine of a badge. "You locked me in," she said. "I kept everyone else out," he replied. "If it wasn't me, you wouldn't be talking right now." He stepped forward and clicked on a small flashlight, pointing it toward the ground. The soft beam lit his face from below, casting sharp shadows under his eyes. He looked older than she remembered. Not just in years but in weight. Like he'd been carrying something for a very long time. "What is this room?" she asked, her voice low. "Why isn't it on any blueprint?" "It was," he said. "Once. Before they started hiding it." "They?" Mills shook his head. "You think this is about one prison? About one warden? You're still thinking too small, Agent Doyle." He moved the flashlight slowly over the old files on the table. The stamped words classified, "Do not archive," glowed in the beam. "You've seen enough to understand the outline," he went on. "Since the 50s, certain inmates didn't go where the paperwork said they went. They came here first. Through here. Through that tunnel." He nodded toward the old photo of the laundry room and the sealed hatch. "For what?" she asked. "Why bring them here?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding how much to say. Some were witnesses. Some were assets. Some were problems that certain people didn't want in public courtrooms. This place was secure, isolated, and easy to hide behind. Procedure. If they wanted someone off the map, Leavenworth was one of the doors. Karen felt a cold anger rising in her chest. So people disappeared and you, what? Helped them? His jaw tightened. I was a rookie when I found out. The ones before me started it. Old captains, visiting suits from DC, men who never used last names. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already tied to it. I didn't sign the first transfers. I just inherited the ghosts. She thought of Harlan's note. They moved him again. Tonight. Is that what happened to Harlan? She asked. And Pike. Mills didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped to the files. Harlan was poking where he shouldn't, he finally said. He saw things when he worked for that contractor. Recognized names. Patterns. When he got sent here, it wasn't random. Someone wanted him under the same roof as the records he'd stumbled on, either to keep him quiet or to make him vanish cleanly. And Pike. Pike overheard the wrong conversation in the infirmary, Mills said quietly. He came to me scared. Said he heard staff talking about reactivating the route. The tunnel. He thought if he helped you he'd be safe. That key he left? He stole it off a retired engineer's old ring I kept in my office. I didn't know he'd taken it until he was already gone. Karen's hands curled into fists. Who's giving the orders now, Mills? Who's signing these transfers? He turned the light onto one of the files. The top page showed a transfer form, yellowed with age. The signature line was redacted in thick black ink. But a second stamp was visible below the blackout. Interagency handling authorized. No one signs with their real name, Mills said. Not on these. They use codes. Initials that change every few years. You can't trace them, not on paper. That's the whole point. Then why keep the files? She asked. Why not destroy all of this? Because someone always wants proof, he replied. Insurance. You bury people, you need a key to dig them back up if it's ever useful. This room is that key. A distant alarm beeped faintly through the pipes, then stopped. The prison above them kept moving like a living machine, unaware of the conversation happening in its oldest bones. So why talk to me? Karen asked. If you've been protecting this for years, why not silence me too? Mills gave a small, bitter smile. You think I could, even if I wanted to? Look at you. You're already taking pictures in your head. She stared at him. He wasn't wrong. You came here thinking this was about one missing inmate, he continued. Maybe two. What you've got on that table is evidence that people disappeared under government protection for decades. Some might have deserved maximum security. Some might not. But none of them were meant to be found again. And the recent ones? She asked. Harlan. Pike. They're not Cold War relics. They're now. Someone's still using this system. Mills swallowed hard. That's what scares me. I haven't opened that tunnel in years. Wasn't supposed to be used again. But if they activated it without me, he shook his head. That means whoever's in charge now doesn't need old gatekeepers anymore. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw real fear in his eyes. Karen picked up one of the newer files from the stack. The date in the corner wasn't from the 60s or 70s. It was from 3 months ago. The transfer origin box said Leavenworth. The destination line was blank. The remarks section only had 2 words. Special handling. There was no inmate number. No name. Just a black bar. They've already scrubbed it, she whispered. Mills nodded. They clean as they go now. The old days left paper trails. The new days leave ghosts. She took out her phone and started snapping photos of everything she could. The classified stamps, the transfer forms, the list of employees who retired and were never seen again. Mills didn't try to stop her. You know that won't be enough, he said quietly. You put this in an official report, it disappears before it hits a desk. You push too hard, you get reassigned or worse. They'll call it a security risk, a misunderstanding, an error in the system. Then why help me? She asked again. His eyes met hers. Because I'm tired of walking past empty cells and pretending I don't know why they're empty. For a moment, the weight of his words pressed on both of them. Then the overhead lights flickered twice and snapped back on. The door behind him slid open with a metallic groan. Someone up above had restored power to the basement. The spell of darkness broke. The hidden room looked less like a secret and more like what it really was. A crime scene made of paper. You should go, Mills said. If they realize you've seen this much while you're still underground, you might not come back up. What about you? She asked. He gave a tired shrug. I've been part of this place my whole life. One way or another, I'm not getting out from under it. But you still can. She stepped toward the door, then paused. "Mills," she said. "One last thing. That note in Pike's cell. Ask who signs the transfers." What do you think he meant? Mills stared at the files and let out a humorless laugh. "Everyone," he answered. "That's the problem." Hours later, Karen stood outside the main gates of Leavenworth, the sky over Kansas turning a dull orange as the sun dropped. The prison loomed behind her, solid and silent, as if nothing unusual had happened inside its walls at all. Her phone felt heavier in her pocket, filled with photos that might never see daylight. Before she got into her car, the warden caught up with her. Keller's face was calm, but his eyes were too careful. "Agent Doyle," he said, "I heard you were looking into some old records. I've been informed your assistance is no longer required. Central has decided to classify the recent incidents as unresolved and close the internal review." Just like that. No explanation. No questions. No interest. "They're still missing," she said. "Harlan. But you're closing this knowing they didn't walk out on their own." He gave her a tight, practiced smile. "Sometimes, Agent, the safest thing for everyone is to accept that not every file has an ending. Good evening." He turned and walked back toward the gates. She watched him disappear inside. 3 days later, in her small apartment miles away, an unmarked envelope slid under her door. No address. No sender. Her name wasn't written on it, but somehow it had found her. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single transfer form printed on fresh white paper. The date was that very week. The origin, another federal facility. The destination, United States Penitentiary Leavenworth. The inmate number box was blank. The remarks section said only, "Special handling, route reactivated." At the bottom, in small, shaky handwriting, someone had added a note. "They still sign the transfers." There were no initials this time. No name. But as Karen stared at the page, she realized the worst part was not that the system had existed. It was that it was still alive. Behind the locked gates of Leavenworth, somewhere in the steam of the laundry rooms and the dust of forgotten tunnels, people could still vanish without a trace. And the real mystery wasn't how they disappeared. It was how many more names would never even make it onto the page.